The sensational vestiges of armed palaces sit on rocky slopes with waves running into steep bluffs dating from the 1300 years. The fortress is in the county of Cornwall in the extreme southwest of England. It's an intriguing remainder from the medieval times. The monarch who presided over the Knights of the Roundtable historians unearthed evidence that could prove the existence of the real King Arthur. King Arthur's story was first recorded in detail by a Welshman, Geoffrey of Monmouth, in 1136. However, it also looms large in the imagination of the British as the dramatic side of the legendary King Arthur's life and times, spread across England and archaic Europe as an interesting story of knights' fights and fair ladies. As many as 250,000 people annually make the pilgrimage to Joe Castle to marvel at the alleged stronghold of King Arthur and his nobles, as the legends of Arthur's bravery continue to reverberate throughout the world. However, the existence of this early British king remains a major mystery, and historians will begin their journey of discovery by tracing Arthur's history as closely as possible. However, as you can see, it is not an easy task to distinguish fact from fiction when it comes to King Arthur. It's a maze of lies, half-truths, and disputing historians. The poem Why God Adam may have been written in 638 AD, which is only about 100 years after Arthur is said to have lived, making it almost contemporaneous with some sources. However, the only copy of this work that is still in existence actually dates from 6 centuries after that. This poem is probably the very first reference to a warrior king named Arthur. Therefore, the reliability of this late copy must be in doubt. A problem that hinders efforts to determine the truth about Arthur is assessing the veracity and accuracy of ancient documents. Arthur is depicted as a British warrior who defended his homeland against the invading Saxons in another work that is said to have been written by a monk named Mineus. However, this work was written around 828, which is about 300 years after Arthur was supposed to have died in battle. The oldest version of that is from 3 centuries later. One more account, the Archives of Ridges, composed by the researchers of St. David's religious community, gives more insight regarding the slippery Arthur, yet this record was written in 977. Again, since Arthur is supposed to have died many hundreds of years ago, it is impossible to know what changes the original manuscript might have had over time. It would appear that ancient sources about King Arthur are rarely reliable. King Arthur's tale was fleshed out by Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century work History of British Kings. Naturally, it was written centuries after Arthur is said to have ruled, like the other sources we mentioned. All things being equal, it is the reason for a large part of the records of the ruler's life that came after the Monmouth home narrative. To put it mildly, serious historians view Monmouth's work with skepticism. Writing in the Smithsonian magazine in September 2022, according to Joshua Hammer, scholars have universally dismissed Geoffrey's text as a fictitious history constructed from ancient Welsh folktales and his febrile imagination. However, Hammer continues by pointing out that many of Geoffrey's contemporaries accepted Monmouth's account as fact. Furthermore, in 1233, Richard Baron of Cornwall really purchased the arm site, persuaded of its Arthurian connections. This Richard was Henry III's brother at the time, who was the English monarch. Richard constructed a castle on the Tentacle site after acquiring ownership, and the resulting ruins can be found there today. He is said to have purchased the Tentacle land by trading 3 of his most valuable estates for a rocky headland with little actual value. However, when Scott gave his opinion on Richard's purchase to the Smithsonian magazine, which had no purpose, he was motivated by the belief that he was purchasing real estate that had once been home to King Arthur. Scott was a local archaeologist. He didn't need it because it was in a faraway part of Cornwall, but he wanted to make a name for himself and a legend in history. He was the Duke of Cornwall, yet he was likewise the replacement of Arthur. Even in the 13th century, the Arthurian legend was so powerful. So what did Monmouth actually say about Arthur? First, he made him king, whereas the other sources we've talked about before only said that he was a local leader and a warrior. Arthur suffered a severe wound during the Saxon invasion of Britain at the Battle of Camlan, according to his account. The Annals of Wales, which we mentioned earlier, also record this battle. Even though Monmouth is where King Arthur is at Camlan, Wales also fought the Battle of Camlan in 537 AD, which is when Arthur died, according to Monmouth. Morgan Le Fay, a mysterious enchantress, took the wounded king to the mythical island of Babylon, where Monmouth ended his account of Arthur's life. Obviously, it was a long way from the finish of Arthur as a legendary figure in the hundreds of years that followed. More than 1,000 duplicates of Monmouth's History of the Lords of England were made and disseminated. Keep in mind that this was before the printing press was invented. Since scribes had to meticulously write out each copy by hand, it became the most widely read book in the world, with the exception of the Bible. The Monmouth's Chronicle truly enjoyed exceptional popularity. As we've seen, present-day students of history respect the work with an enormous aiding of incredulity. In any case, even time permitting, there were the people who respected his record of Lord Arthur with doubt. William of Newburgh, a chronicler and contemporary of Monmouth, wrote that he had serious doubts about the accuracy of everything he wrote about Arthur and his successors, as well as his predecessors. The Arthurian legends of Monmouth didn't just spread to England, they also made their way across the English Channel to France and other European nations, where the story of Arthur kept getting more complicated. The myth includes a French author known as Crate T in Detroit, whose own contributions appear to have been encouraged by the British and French royal houses. Expert on King Arthur Richard Barber stated to Smithsonian magazine that the Arthur legend took off 100 years later, with Arthur appearing in Germany and Italy. Detroit has added details to the French version, including a brand new character named Sir Lancelot and a brand new location called Camelot. He also talked about the search for the Holy Grail, a cup that Jesus is said to have drunk from at the Last Supper. Geoffrey of Monmouth's version of the Arthurian legend continued to have a significant impact on British monarchs and 1191 monks at Glastonbury Abbey, 95 miles east of Tentacle, where two sets of human remains were disinterred. The monks claimed that these were King Arthur and Guinevere's skeletons. It's possible that this was just an effort to get people to visit the abbey and spend money. King Edward I, who ruled for 35 years beginning in 1272 and was referred to as Longshanks due to his unusual height, completely believed those monks, regardless of their motivations. In his 2015 book, An Extraordinary and Horrendous Ruler, Edward the Primary in the Manufacturing of England, imprint Morris composed, it was evidence positive that the spectacular lord about whom Geoffrey of Monmouth had composed had once truly existed. At least, that's what Edward thought when he first heard about the alleged grave of Arthur and Guinevere. When Edward went there, the bodies were dug up again so the king could look at the holy remains. It's possible that Edward was concerned about the possibility of the existence of a superstition asserting that Arthur was still alive. That could indicate that the ancient king posed a threat to Edward's throne. The ruler and his sovereign, who had went with him, were probably feeling better to see that the skeletal remaining parts were of a couple who were conclusively perished. The skeletons were finally returned to the tranquil sanctuary of their graves after Edward wrapped them in silk. The Frenchman Detroit has added many colorful flourishes to the Arthurian saga, which reinforces once more the extraordinary power of the myth, even or perhaps especially over British royalty. He made the observation that Merlin served as Arthur's military advisor and even led a charge carrying a banner depicting a dragon that breathed fire, as any self-respecting mythical beast ought to. Detroit has also shown Vivienne, the Lady of the Lake, who is said to have given Arthur the terrifying sword Excalibur. Another colorful character, this one British, gave the story his own personal touches. The first person to write about King Arthur in plain prose, rather than poetry, was Sir Thomas Malory, who lived in the second half of the 15th century. Britannica says that Malory's personal history is a bit hazy, but it's possible that he was in prison when he wrote Lemoore Arthur or when Arthur died. So what has made the account of ruler Arthur, his sovereign Guinevere in the Knights of the Round Table, such a getting-through legend? Addressing Smithsonian magazine, teacher Lee Teller of Bristol College said there is something in the Arthur legend for everybody. It has defective characters, with whom we can understand to accomplish unthinkable objectives, and a versatile storyline that fits the socio-political scene of the time. Dr. Tether goes on to say that the interesting thing about the Arthurian legend is that it has periods of ups and downs. It can be adapted to fit current concerns so that it can be useful no matter what the mood is. Stories were told orally and in manuscripts, so no two versions are the same. Dr. Teller concluded by stating that it is actually impossible to identify an original Arthur. Arthur's offer is and forever was exactly in his variety. The Arthurian legend certainly does not appear to have lost any of its appeal in recent times. The 3,000 people who came to attend to Jewel every day during the summer provide evidence of that. Scott explains that these throngs of tourists are under the impression that they are seeing King Arthur's castle, and that some people in Cornwall make a good living from the visitors to the Tentacle ruins. 3 ages of the Parsons family, for instance, own territory in the town of Butcher's Scaffold, only a couple of miles from Arm. The Parsons, who own a museum and gift shop, claim that the Battle of Camlin, which was the battle in which Arthur was killed, took place on their land. The Campbell Waterway goes through the Parsons' land. A stone column with an inscription that may or may not have once mentioned Arthur is floating in the water. As is the case with Arthurian legend, the truth is often elusive, but the tourists and the money they spend are sufficient evidence. However, is it conceivable to connect the fantasies and legends encompassing Arthur to a genuine verifiable figure, small time, who has been doing exactly that for a really long time? Student of history Nicholas Hyam was an undergrad at the College of Manchester during the 1970s when Arthurian legend originally turned into a subject of study for him. Despite the work of respected academics like University of Glasgow archaeologist Leslie Alcock and English historian John Morris, many serious researchers at the time were trying to find evidence that Arthur had actually existed. However, they were unsuccessful, and many of them eventually gave up and became skeptical. They and other people claimed that there was proof that the Arthurian legend was true. Greetings. I made sense of his dismissal of their work. He stated to Smithsonian magazine, "The constant flow of very bad history writing was what really got me fired up. Hello, I'm presided. There are a lot of writers, like Alcock and Morris, who believe that what happened around AD 500 is true, even though it wasn't recorded until the early 9th and 10th centuries. That is absurd." However, Scott does not dismiss Arthurian myths as dismissively. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like it, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. That way, you'll be the first to know when I upload something new.